My name's Jonathan Adams. I work for Digital Science, and lots of you don't. So I don't know all of you, but we will over the years. This afternoon's talk is from Imran Khan, who's the Chief Executive of the British Science Association, which I used to know as the British Association for the Advancement of Science, who run a fantastic science festival each year, which I think Imran's going to talk about. Imran's background is that he was a biologist, and he's worked at Oxford, Imperial, the Cass Business School, as well as having a variety of policy and implementation-orientated posts since then, which he will outline as well. So he's in an incredibly good position to have a view across not only sort of the science field, but also how we communicate what's happening in science to that much wider audience of people who want to know what science does, what it delivers, and why it's valuable. And given the announcements this week, with 150 million being cut off university budgets, a large part of which is science funding, that is really going to be very, very important in terms of what we communicate to the politicians in the next few years. Imran.
Thank you very much. I think I'm using this slide. So before I start, I wanted to just get a sense of who my audience is. So I understand there's a number of digital science people here. Who's from digital science? Okay. And is everyone else then from elsewhere in the middle? Is that the way this works? Okay. And who would describe themselves as a scientist? Okay. And separate to that, how many people have got a background in science, study science? Okay, so most people in the room are either scientists or study science, and the rest of you are just interested and engaged, and that's really exciting too. Okay, that's really good. Basis to start from. So before I go into the depths of my talk, I thought I'd just say a bit about who I am and what I do, and then I'll go into why I do it. So as Jonathan said, I originally studied biology. That was my first degree, and like many people, having gone through a university degree, I got halfway through and thought, this is all really fascinating, but I need a patient or intelligent enough to become a research scientist, so what can I do instead? And after a bit of toing and froing, I ended up doing a master's in science communication at Imperial College, and that led me down the track to doing a bit of science writing, so I did a bit of work for The Guardian, the World Health Organization, a bit of broadcast for Radio 4, and then kind of went completely sideways and got a job working in House of Commons for an MP called Dr. Evan Harris, no longer an MP, but he was a science spokesman for the Lib Dems, not a lot of them around anymore. So I spent a few years in Parliament basically trying to be a pro-science person in the House of Commons, which was an interesting experience, and I'll say a bit more about that. And then I ran a body called the Campaign for Science and Engineering, which is all about promoting science in politics more generally. And then 2 years ago, I took over as Chief Exec at the British Science Association. And in other roles, I'm also trustee of a really fantastic international development charity called Practical Action, which focuses on using technology to challenge poverty around the world. And I'm also going to be taking over as a board member at the National Environment Research Council, which is the UK's biggest funder of environmental research. So there's a whole range of stuff there, and I'm going to talk at you about science and culture and science. Not just a scientist, which is the title of my talk, but I'm hoping to get through it as quickly as possible, and then leave lots of room for questions at the end. So if you want to talk to me about any part of my career, or what I think about all the stuff that I've been exposed to, really keen to do that, not just limited to what I'm going to get on to. But without further ado, so I think I originally gave the title of this talk as a science, not just for scientists, and that's a sort of shorthand I use for trying to capture what I think is wrong between the relationship between the kind of science that we're often exposed to and the rest of society and the rest of culture. So I'm going to give you a bit of evidence to show why I think that relationship is broken, or at least it can be markedly improved. And then I'm going to give you 3 ways I think we can improve that relationship. And the short summary is basically, I think the thing that's wrong is that we seem to think that science is mostly just for scientists. And the 3 things that we can do to fix it are to get people to do real science, expose them to real scientists, and also have a bit more of an open culture around how we relate science to the rest of what's going on in society. So, I said I'd talk you through the evidence why I think there is a problem. And the backdrop to this is we often feel like science is quite aligned Right, yeah. I think people that have studied science, think of themselves as scientists, often look at the rest of society and go, wow, that's not very scientific. And then we feel a bit down about it. And that's actually pretty weird if you think about the fact that, this is a country that's got a tremendous number of, fantastic research institutions, whether it's the top Russell Group universities or all the rest of them. We've got national academies like the Royal Society. We've got entire departments which are just, government departments focused on supporting science. We've got all this kind of, what should be political power, saying science is brilliant, and the CBI talks about it as well. And yet, when we come and look at the rest of science, we go, oh, it's not quite good enough. So that's a bit of a weird dichotomy, and I'd like to talk you through my understanding of why that's the case. So just a bit of a run through some kind of numbers and facts. So careers is one that we often talk about. Science is brilliant. Why don't more people want to go into science? So this is stats from the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry, and they do surveys of employers to figure out, do we have enough skills? So the question, are we producing enough skilled graduates in STEM? If you ask industry employers, 60% say no. If you ask academia, 80% say no. So that's a huge number. And even when you look outside skilled graduates, and STEM skills in particular, if you look at all employers across the country, 40% say they're struggling to employ people. So that's the first half of that question is about looking into the future. Are we producing enough in the future? The second half of it is right now struggling as well. So there's clearly a huge problem there. Politics, again, happy to answer questions on this at the end, but this is one of my two favourite vignettes. This is actually from the last Parliament, so I haven't updated these figures for the election we just had. But if you look at across the 650 odd MPs we've got as a whole, 156 from business, 100 are either civil servants who come from local governments or have come from other aspects of politics, so that works at parties, that works in local governments, 86 lawyers, 38 media professionals, so journalists, PR people, all the rest of it, and there was one lonely scientist amongst that 646. That's not the entire story, because that's only looking at professions, so there's lots of people that will have either studied science or worked in allied fields or been non-science with really passionate interest in science. But it gives an indication of, if you're sitting there as a scientist looking at the House of Commons, you might think, that's not very representative of where I feel we should be. And as I mentioned, I've spent a few years working in the House of Commons, and it was a real revelation to me, having had scientific training, being taught to look at the world in a particular way, and then suddenly coming into this kind of august institution which is on the news all the time. You think it's hugely respectable, or sort of anyway. This is before the expensive scandal. And just finding out that the view you hold about the world doesn't seem to be reflected in the view that our decision-making authorities hold about the world. So the guy I was working for was Evan Harris, and this was a piece of legislation that was going through the House of Commons looking at prostitution. So the key question was, the Labour government at the time was bringing in some regulations to say that the way they're going to reduce the harms associated with prostitution was by increasing the criminality of it, basically making it more illegal for prostitutes to do what they do. And the government was saying, we need to do this to reduce the harm, and the opposition, including the guy I was working for, was up saying, well, actually there's some evidence to say that you could increase the harm by doing this. You could actually drive further underground, further away from law enforcement and healthcare, and actually you might have the opposite effect to what you intended. So this was the debate that was going on. And the government has said that they've produced a report that's full of evidence to support their position. And Evan came to this committee saying, you say that you produced this evidence in your review, but that evidence has not been published yet. So what's going on? And the minister in charge, Vernon Kirk, was like, no, it's not been published. So Evan makes what we might think is quite a reasonable point, saying, so here we are making laws, they were literally in the House of Commons voting on whether this legislation should go through or not, with this evidence supposedly having been published. Evan says, so here we are making laws, you're asserting you're making an evidence-based decision. We cannot see that evidence. On the contrary, we've had suggestions from the Royal College of Nursing and others that suggest that what you're doing, that everyone mentioned, could be counterproductive in terms of harm reduction. And again, that was the overriding goal which the government said they had in mind. And again, this is me perhaps a few weeks into the job, sitting at the back of this committee room, watching this debate unfold, sort of just getting to terms with the fact that this is actually law being, the whole sausage factory idea, this is the law being made. And then while I'm having all these thoughts, this comes back from the minister in charge of getting this bill through. He said, we're looking at publishing the evidence. As I say, you pick the evidence which, in the end, backs your arguments. And, you know, my jaw hit the floor. I was like, what is going on here? Are we speaking the same language about what evidence means? And I took from this and a number of other interactions that politics wasn't very scientific. I mean, you knew it, right? But really, it was a bit of a wake-up call that, you know, you might think it's quite far away, but actually the level of mutual understanding is incredibly low, and the way in which politics reflects the viewpoints that I had, and I expect many of you have, is just, you know, there's very little correlation. So we've had careers, we've had politics. What about funding? What about public funding for science? So there's a great website called ScienceGram, which produces a lot of, run by one guy, who produces a lot of data on how science is supported through public funds. And this analysis is based on saying, well, we will spend about £700 billion a year, that's the whole of government spending, and there's about 63 million people in the country. So you can do a very simple calculation. That means on behalf of each of us, the government is spending 11 grand. Straightforward. So you look at what that 11 grand is, and approximately 4 grand of it goes to pensions and benefits. The next biggest chunk is healthcare, £2,000, then it's education, 1,000, and then defence, and then all the other stuff is 3.5. How much of that 11 grand is R&D? So how much is the government spending on each of our behalf on science, effectively? It's very little, so it's 33 pounds for health, 27 for defence, 5 for energy, and 100 for other miscellaneous research. So again, what's that up to? So that's £165 for each of us every year, out of the total budget the government holds on our behalf of £11,000. And you know, look at that energy figure, £5. So the government is spending on your behalf £5 a year on energy research. How much are you spending on your energy bill every year? To put that into context, you know, again, you look at these sorts of figures as someone that comes from the world of science saying, are we taking a rational view here? Would the sensible thing not to be to say, if we really want to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, if we want to be more energy efficient, we should be actually finding a way to shift some spending, you know, into energy research, and you can say the same thing about health and all sorts of other areas. So again, coming from a scientific worldview, this feels weird. And again, just to put some of this into context, Andrew, the guy who did this, looked at the comparisons between some of the big ticket things we spend money on. So we think of the NHC as being, you know, a really big ticket item, dwarfed by the London 2012 Olympics. The projected cost of coming up with nuclear fusion, again, dwarfed by the UK bailout. And the bottom one really blows my mind. The entire world's health research spending from the year 1981 to 2010 was 1/3 of what one country spent on the Iraq War. So again, very, very different perspectives from within science and from where our decision makers and policy makers sit. And that's not just public spending. This is a graph showing gross domestic expenditure on R&D. So this isn't just government spending, it's across the whole economy. How much spending do you get on science? And what it's often used for is another term used to describe it as knowledge intensity. So if you look at an overall economy, what proportion of their GDP gets spent on research and development? This is I think it's a G7 countries, and you can see that the UK is just under 2%, which is way behind Japan, US, Germany, France, and even Canada, ahead of Italy though, so that's good. This data, you might be able to see the number, the data gets up to the end of 2009. The figures haven't shifted very much since then, they've been fairly static for all those countries. So that's a few areas. What about the public? So we've heard about decision makers, we've heard about careers. What does the public think? There's a great survey that the government does every 3 years or so called Public Attitudes to Science. There's a lot of mixed messages in there, but I thought I'd pick out some of the ones that kind of resonate for me. 55% of the public say they do not feel informed about science. So over half of the public, so just over half of the public, think the benefits of science outweigh the harmful effects. And 58% of scientists put too little effort into informing the public of their work, so there's some words missing there. The middle one of those really interests me, because when it was reported in the press release that came out with this, it was really trumpeted, saying over half of the public think the benefits of science outweighs harmful effects. Or I look at that and think, have we really only convinced just over half the people that science is on balance more beneficial than harmful? So yeah, interesting there as well. The media, we think of the problems with science in the media, so you think about NMR, you think about DOC, you think of all that kind of stuff as being not quite ancient history, but we should have moved on by now. You should have actually got a better settlement between science and how it's reported and how the media looks at science and all that kind of stuff. This was a report in April last year, so just over a year old, from a House of Commons Select Committee, saying that the government and the BBC are still getting it wrong communicating climate science. One of the big things they picked up on was this issue of a false balance. People know what false balance is. Spotting a few not, but so the idea is that if you go on if you tune into the news at night and you've got an issue being debated like healthcare, what the news organisation will tend to do is say, right, we'll get one voice from Tories and one voice from Labour, and therefore, because we're representing both sides, that's a balanced debate. We're not giving either side more credit or more power in this debate than the other, which is sort of fine if you kind of look at the classic two-party system. But then when you try and apply something like climate change, what you do is you get a scientist saying climate change is real, we've got lots of evidence to show this happening, and then you get someone from the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which says it's all hokum, these are just scientists looking for more funding, why the winter's getting colder if the climate change is real. They have got better, but what the Select Committee was saying was, despite 10 years pretty much of Select Committees of scientists and all these other people saying you're consistently making this mistake and it's really dumb, they're still doing it. So we haven't got to where we want to be in the media as well. I'm sure you'll all come with all of your own personal opinions on what particular bit of media could be better when it comes to promoting science. And then, coming almost full circle, looking at schools, I find this really interesting data. So this is part of a longitudinal study that's being done at King's College London by a group called Aspires, and they're looking at the same group of kids every year and then seeing how their attitudes to science change as they grow up, which is really valuable data, really hard to do because you've got to have long-term funding and follow the same individuals, all that kind of stuff. But once you've got it, it's fascinating. So obviously year 6 is kind of 9 or 10 years old, and they're looking at their opinions of science as they change. And what I find really interesting is that when you look at kids getting kind of out of primary school, year 6, year 8, and then getting towards GCSE level age, all the key indicators start to dip. They start to find science less interesting in school, they start to find them less exciting, and they start to not look forward to science lessons. And there's that classic adage, which is that everyone is born a scientist, everyone is born curious about the world and wanting to experiment and kind of having an open mind. And somehow, maybe not surprised by this, somehow we're starting to beat that curiosity out of them just at the age at which they start to do GCSEs. The really good news, that's not good news, but the good news is that this study has had its funding extended. So what we're going to see over the next couple of years is hopefully the next iterations of this group as they progress through the school system, coming through and seeing what that data shows. I think we can take a guess that those numbers can continue to fall, but I'll be really interested to see what happens. And what shapes these attitudes? So this is really complicated to follow, but effectively what it's saying is if you look at whether kids want to go into science, what are the biggest effects on that? So when you're looking at kids in year 9, the aspirations that they had 3 years ago when they were in year 6 produced 0.16 of that effect. So if you look at one, if one single effect was producing all of the aspiration, you just get a 1, but that's producing 0.16 of the effect. The single biggest driver of young kids' aspirations relative to science is their attitudes towards school science. So there are other big drivers like parents, like whether they can see themselves being scientists, all that kind of stuff, but their attitudes towards school science are the single biggest driver of whether these kids are going to be interested in science or not when they grow up. And all the data shows that we're somehow getting it wrong and we're kind of driving them away from science, which is really unfortunate. So, that is what I wanted to present as the evidence. Oh, there's one more bit of evidence, which is a slightly more personal anecdote. the next slide I'm going to show you is, I think, behind a lot of what you see in this data. And that's this. Has anyone got fond memories of this experiment? So, although I'm now chief executive of the British Science Association, when I was about 14, I hated science. Basically, stuff like this. My primary recollection of science activities in school is you do experiments like this where you chop up bits of potatoes, you put them in different concentrations of saline solution, and you weigh them to measure the effects of osmosis, and you're meant to get a nice clean graph that shows you how osmosis works. Except that's never what happens at all. All you get is bits of solid potato everywhere. You can't get the right result, but you know what the teacher expects you to get, so you just draw a line anyway. And at the end of the experiment, no one has learned a single thing apart from how to get the teacher, how to get the result the textbook says you should have. And again, I think there's a lot in that potato that I think we could learn from how not to do science. So that is my evidence to you of where I think we're going wrong, or at least the evidence that shows you that something is wrong. That we as people who are scientists, like science, study science, look at the outside world and go, that just doesn't compute with how I expect and how I want the world to look like as someone that enjoys science. And again, it's weird because we have the power structures to change that. We have a government minister for science, we have a National Academy of Science, we have all these bodies and people in the media that should be able to change this for us, and yet for the past 10, 20 years, the slides I've shown now, I could have shown 5 years ago, I could have shown 10 years ago. We're having these moments over and over again, and nothing is changing. And the question is why? And I think there's, again, it comes back to what I was saying at the beginning. I think the big thing is that we too often divorce science from the rest of culture and society. We pretend it's in the same box, and it's, we need to kind of take it out of this box and plonk it into different areas rather than getting rid of the box altogether. So that's going to be the second half of my talk, how do we get rid of that box. I did put that in my notes, I'm just coming up with the ideas on the fly, which isn't great. But my first cure for this problem is following straight on from this. And what I'm going to show you next is, I think, kind of the antithesis of the soggy potato. If you think of this as the worst part of school science, I think this illustrates what can be the best. So this wasn't a story in the Daily Mirror 2 years ago, and it's amazing. This might seem like a weird headline until you see the photo that I'm about to show you. So these are genuinely brothers. They're not. There's no funny business with the photo going on here. They're genuinely brothers. That's one brother, that's the other. So George was really interested to know why he had normal hair and why his brother had a frizzy red afro. And he was so fascinated about this that he decided to build a polymerase chain reactor machine in his parents' garage to find out. And that's research. That's not looking at a textbook and saying, I'm going to follow this recipe effectively to get to a result which teachers say I should have. Here's a genuine research question, and I feel empowered to go and do it myself. And this guy was 15 or 16 at the time he started this. And again, had lots of support from his teachers, lots of support from his parents. The say-so from his dad, who was very kind of firm in his own masculinity, not to be worried about his children DNA testing themselves. But I think that's a really fascinating example of how, and he then won our Young Scientist of the Year competition. So he got one of our awards, entered the national competition, was crowned UK Young Scientist of the Year in 2013 because of this work. And I feel like that's just a million miles away from the experience of science that I had when I was in school. And what we try and do is replicate the experience that George had with as many people as possible. So we run a scheme called the CREST Awards. So CREST stands for Creativity in Science and Technology. And it operates in the same principle as what George is doing. And again, not everyone will be able to go to quite the lengths that he did. But it's built around that principle that science is not being told what the answer is. It's not following a recipe. It's actually finding a research question and using your imagination and your curiosity to figure out how you can answer it. And essentially, these kids do a set amount of project work, they take charge of it themselves, they do a certain number of hours, and then they get a bronze, silver, or a gold award to mark the work that they've done. And we're getting up towards 35,000 awards being given out this year. We've just launched a version of this for primary schools, and one of the big challenges we have is that in secondary schools, there's this awards scheme is really mediated by science teachers. So we get really passionate science teachers who want to do stuff in lunchtimes, after schools, to get these kids into these awards. And that's brilliant because often those science teachers are really passionate about science, as you'd expect. The challenging thing is you don't really get many science specialist primary school teachers. How do you give primary school teachers who might have never studied science at all since perhaps GCSE level the confidence to go and do scientific work with their kids? So we've launched a primary school version called Crest Star, which tries to accomplish that. And again, it focuses on teamwork, creativity, independent project work. It's not this idea that it's just about doing experiments, but it's about putting science in a kind of broader context, the skills that we want all young people to have. And we've just launched a tie-in scheme with the Duke of Edinburgh's Award. And one of the kind of the pet peeves I have is that, I mean, it's not so much with the Crest Awards, but there's often the sense that if you've done a science degree at university and then you've not gone on to become a scientist, you'll get people from your family or friends saying, well, you know, you did chemistry and then you didn't become a research chemist. Wasn't that a waste? No one says, well, you did a Duke of Edinburgh's Award and you didn't become a professional explorer. Wasn't that a waste? And yet we have a sense of, you know, what's the use of getting involved in science if you're not going to go and then use it? Which no one puts that bar on other subjects. So we're really excited to have this new tie-in where if you get the Silver Crest Award, that counts towards your skill in Duke of Edinburgh. And that's putting science and saying, actually, this is one of the skills, alongside lots of other skills, that you can have to function as a member of society. And one of the really exciting things at the moment is that we are hopefully working with digital science to turn a lot of the work and the ideas we're putting out there with Crest into some kind of digital product that we can start to roll out in schools, and that's very early stages, but me and Steve and the team have been having a few conversations about that, so fingers crossed to be able to launch something later in the year. So that's schools. This is a picture of a neutrino detector. I think it's the one at Gran Sasso in Italy. And the reason I bring it up is because, so the first cure there was we need to expose people to real science. This kind of follows on from that. This detector was in the news, I think it was maybe 4 years ago. You'll probably remember the story. There was an incident where scientists at this neutrino detector were picking up neutrinos that had been transmitted from the Large Hadron Collider just over the border at CERN in Geneva. And of course, so neutrinos are these tiny particles with enormous no mass, they interact with hardly anything, so you've got to build a giant detector like this to have any ability to pick up even a tiny, just one neutrino. And what they were picking up was that the neutrinos were arriving at this detector faster than the speed of light after having been generated at the LHC. And that's really weird because nothing can go faster than the speed of light. So they scratched their heads for a while and they couldn't figure out what was causing this result. And they then published. And that's really, really unusual. And you got some amazing stories in the media after this. So it went really big. So you had Nature reporting on particles breaking light speed limits. You had Jim Al-Khalili at the Daily Mail saying he'll eat his shorts if it's proved right. You had a brilliant article in the BBC saying, well, if neutrinos can go faster than the speed of light, and therefore Einstein was wrong about that, what else was he wrong about? Could there be time travel? Could there be wormholes? Could there be all this sort of stuff? And what eventually happened was, once it had been in the news for a while, the scientists at Gran Sasso had realised that actually there'd been a combination of calculation errors and faulty equipment that meant that actually the neutrinos are going at normal neutrino speed and not faster than light speed, and it was all not as exciting as we first thought. And I thought this was really fascinating because what would normally happen, I mean that happens all the time. The scientist gets weird results, goes and looks at it again, finds out that it wasn't that weird after all, and then the world settles down. But this time, that was happening in public. Normally that happens just in a lab or in an institution, or perhaps in your own head. You normally don't say to the whole world, we think Einstein was wrong, and here we did. And it was brilliant. We had all this debate, all this interest, all this intrigue about how science actually works. The what-ifs that we all talk about, the the leaps of faith and the leaps of imagination, the insight into what science really is. Testing hypotheses, getting weird results, checking whether they're right or not. rather than, I sometimes think that if you haven't been exposed to science, you think that science is sort of looking at the book of nature and just reading out of it, when actually it's a much more dynamic and very human process. And this story, despite the fact that it was all wrong in the end, gave the public a glimpse into that. And I feel like we're scared to show people behind the scenes. And if you look at some of the comments on other websites at the end of this, there are a lot of people comments saying, well, what do these scientists know? They can't even get a simple result right. And I think that's sort of the reaction people are scared of, the idea that if we admit in public that science is actually all about uncertainty rather than fact. It's all about the kind of the transient nature of knowledge and truth rather than objective facts and everything, that science's authority will be diminished. Whereas actually what we find is that when we do open up those ideas, the public interest in science as a process has vastly increased. And I think we're not learning enough that lesson to do that more. And I'll show you another example of how I think this happens. So both of those examples were about showing people real science and how that can have an effect and getting people to do real science. The next one is about real scientists. And again, this was an interesting controversy that happened in the news probably a bit longer ago, maybe 5-6 years ago. This was the famous hacking incident, ClimateGate, when some unknown hackers hacked into the University of East Anglia Climate Research Unit. And they found all these emails where climate researchers had been emailing each other about the data they were going to publish and saying, can we fix that data? Can we change this graph? Can we present this in a different way? And the way that the story was spun was that these world-leading climate researchers were actually spinning the data, that the data didn't support what they were saying, that this was leading up to the Copenhagen climate talks, that it was all just a fraud, and this went global. So they've got front page tabloids papers here. This is Fox News in the US. Again, this is a game changer in the fight for global warming. And it was a real, I guess, soul-searching moment for people that involved in the communication of climate science, because there's obviously little to no doubt in scientific circles that climate change is real and that there's a huge job to be done to convince policymakers to do something about it. And yet, we also know that the definition of fact and truth in science is different to the definition of fact and truth in politics. In that if we say, well, we're not 100% certain about climate change, because nothing in life is 100%, nothing in science is 100% certain, that's not a message that's received with the kind of intent that it should be. So how do you go about communicating uncertainty? How do you go about saying, well, we've got models that show there could be this or there could be that more research is always needed, that we'll never be at the end of the road, that models can never be perfect. How do you communicate that effectively? And where do you draw the line between saying here is what we absolutely know for certain, and here is what we're 99.5% sure of, versus here's what's probably going to happen, in my opinion. Here's what I think as a scientist who's not a climate scientist, because I can, I believe as a scientist, even though I'm not a researcher myself. I'm not a practicing scientist. I'm the chief executive of an organisation that promotes science. I'm sure if I came out and said something, saying that climate change is wrong, I'd be reported as senior scientific figure says something about climate change, despite the fact that I'm not a climate researcher. So, obviously I shouldn't do that. But does that mean that, if one of you, who's not a climate researcher, has their opinion on climate change, should you talk about it? These are all kind of questions that we're having then, still having now. And there's a bit of soul-searching after this incident to say, have we got that balance right? What was really interesting after that, and this is a few months afterwards, there was some research done at Stanford University looking at how the American public's view of climate change changed as a result of ClimateGate. And what they found was really interesting. They found that most people who changed their views as a result of ClimateGate became more convinced, not less convinced, that global warming was real, which is a really counterintuitive result. You'd expect that if you had these emails flying around showing uncertainty, showing potential fixing of data, that you might get people going, well, obviously it's all rubbish. The opposite was true, and more people believing it was real. And Michael Brooks, who's written a brilliant book on science and the interesting figures in science, argued that the story behind this result was that people who were unsure about whether to trust scientists got a glimpse of scientists being human and thought that was okay. When you read the emails, you could see the actual human language that scientists use with each other when they're emailing each other, rather than the dry technical language that you see when you see them on TV or when they're writing a paper in Nature, right? When you see that kind of language, you can't relate to it. But when you see people saying, how do we best communicate this result? You know, this is my job, this is something I care about, this is something I'm passionate about. What is the best way for me to do my job? Giving people that glimpse of scientists being real people with emotions and passions and motivations actually made them more trustworthy, which I think is really interesting. Again, something we often don't like to acknowledge. I talked about the Public Attitudes to Science survey. This is from the last iteration, sorry, the last but one iteration. I haven't repeated this question, sadly. And two of the questions were the traits the public were least likely to use to describe scientists and most likely to use to describe scientists. Anyone like to guess what the least likely term to describe scientists was? Very close. 9%. Good at PR, zero. And yeah, a lot of hands went up when I asked the scientists here. You all seem pretty friendly. You've been very nice to me so far. It's clear there's a mismatch between how scientists actually are and how they're portrayed and how the public see us. And then the most likely was serious. So yeah, bang on, not fun. And that's really, I mean, A, it's really unhelpful for all the reasons I just talked about, and B, it's just wrong as well. You know, we tend to think of some of the most maverick science that gets done as being the most out there, the most interesting, and the most in many ways fun. And you know, so this is still the kind of the stereotype that I think is out there in terms of the public. If you look at this data, again, we're changing that in terms of the media representation of scientists, but if you look at what people are actually saying in terms of the behaviours and the traits that scientists have, it's clear that we still have a problem to fix. And, you know, I'm not sure Kerry Mullis is the best role model for a whole range of things, but it's interesting, you know, he is a Nobel Prize winner. He came up with the polymerase chain reaction. It is just groundbreaking science. And the way he did it was, you know, by virtue of having been kind of off his head quite a lot of the time on LSD. And that's an image of science we don't like to present. Again, we like to preserve this kind of this mystery, this authority, this kind of grandiosity of science, rather than exemplifying that it's a really human activity. And even the most kind of stereotypical scientist of all, Albert Einstein, if you look at what he's written about himself, he talks about, you know, the idea that if you try to work everything out logically, working things out by deduction is far beyond the capacity of human thinking. And yet that's exactly what we try and tell young people how science, you know, that's what we say how science works when we talk to young people, that it's all about logic, it's about deduction, it's about, you know, working things out step by step. It's definitely not about flights of fancy or imagination or jumping to conclusions and testing them and all the rest of it. So I think we're telling entirely the wrong story about how science works and about scientists themselves as well. And I'm going to skip over the next slide, but I'm going to show you some examples of how I think this is changing, how we should do more of. And I remember this, overly honest research methods, that's a trending hashtag on Twitter for a while. I thought this was brilliant because it started as an in-joke among scientists, and it started trending massively because actually the public loved it. You know, people who weren't scientists thought this was brilliant. It was an insight to how scientists really behave and really feel about their work that they don't normally get to see. This is one of my favourites. Reagent became unavailable in 2002 because no one was ordered one risking terrorist watch lists. Paywall, I'm not going to bring that up. One last one. Oh, no, that's one. I'm not saying Twitter is the answer for everything. It clearly can be misused. But I think there is a real case to be said, and I actually think Brian is one of the best examples of this, of showing scientists as real people and not just kind of figures in, priest-like figures of authority that are going to hand knowledge down to one eye. So, real science and real scientists. My last point is kind of opening up the walls of science and getting some real engagement. And I think this is the slide that I kind of want to most impose upon you in terms of how science is different to other parts of society. So let's say over here we've got the public, and we're all included in that. And at the top we've got people in professions. We've got people that work in music, we've got politicians, we've got scientists. You could substitute in sports people or artists or a whole number of different things. So people that get paid to do a certain profession, everyone else. And what you tend to find in most areas of life is that there's always people in the middle. So for every person that works as a music tech or a songwriter or a performing artist, there are people who will buy the t-shirt and go to the gig and play an instrument on the weekend. For every person that's a professional politician or a spin doctor or a political journalist or someone who works for a party, there are probably millions of people that go on marches, that are members of political parties, that will shout at question time, that will engage. And again, for every artist, there will be 1,000 people that will go to art galleries or pick up their own paints on a weekend, or feel like, despite not being a professional artist, that art is part of their identity, art is part of who they are, art is part of how they define themselves, their consumption, their engagement, their argument, and all the rest of it. And when it comes to science, yes, we have this professional class of people we like to call scientists, but what's the parallel for science? In science, where are the people who buy the t-shirt and go to the gig? Who are they? What kind of behaviours are the equivalent of those? I think the lack of, or the shortage, let's say, of those types of behaviours, those types of people, are behind a lot of the problems I was talking about earlier. When we're looking at science funding, who is making the case for more science funding? It's the people with a vested interest, it's people who stand to gain. Yes, they've got, we would argue we've got legitimate philosophical long-term aim saying if we invest more in science, in 20 years' time the world's going to be a better place. But actually, let's be honest, we've got a vested interest as well. Our salary's going to go up, there's going to be more people like us, all the rest of it. Whereas when your local hospital is under threat, it's not just the doctors and nurses that work there that campaign against it, it's everyone who's got a connection with that hospital because they think it's part of who they are and they value it. And I think we haven't done enough to actually get give non-scientists a license to feel a bit of ownership over science in the same way that we feel ownership over other parts of our culture. So what can we do to change that? I think it is changing. Here's a slide full of examples of things you can do. Top left, Galaxy Zoo, one of the world's biggest citizen science experiments, giving people a way in to do science themselves. Got some biohackers, top right, I think they're from the London Biohacking Club. Bottom right, we've got the British Science Festival, which is one of a huge variety of science festivals that's springing up now. We've got half travels around the country. We're going to Bradford this year. We were in Birmingham last year, but there's a brilliant ongoing one in Cheltenham, in Manchester, in Edinburgh, in Cambridge. Brighton's got another moving one. And then there's another citizen science experiment in the bottom left here. In the Midnight Plus, a crowdfunding graphic. So we're experimenting with ways to say, if people are going onto sites like Crowdcube and Seeders and Funding Circle to invest their money, can we say, well, if you feel really passionately about science, let's give you a way to put your money where your mouth is and let you literally buy into science and own a bit of it. And if there are companies or universities or researchers who need funding to do their work, let's give you the way to back that. Elsewhere in culture, we've got more and more political campaigns that ask for evidence. It's a way for the public to basically challenge anyone to say what's the evidence behind your marketing claim or your political claim. We had Science is Vital, which had over 30,000 signatures to the government to try and protect science. You've probably all heard of the All Trials campaign, which is campaigning for the pharmaceutical companies to publish all of their data, not just the positive results. Increasingly in culture, again, we've got science festivals, but we've got, like something about science on Facebook that's got how many million followers, I don't know, but it's just been a phenomenon. Radiolab, if you've never heard of Radiolab, check it out. It's a brilliant blend of how you can look at science through lots of different lenses, through people's interaction with medicine, through space, through music, rather than say, here's a story of how an experiment happened. So these are all ways that this is changing. And I think we need more of these. We need more of these behaviours that people can have and things they can do outside of their professional lives that are ways for them to say, I'm not a scientist, but science is still part of who I am and what I do, in a way that we have in other parts of culture. And just because it's taken me, because we've got a couple of minutes left, I thought I'd give you a sense of what I think doesn't help. And these are two comics that I really enjoyed. One of these is from Cyanide and Happiness, which I'll give you a moment to read. So again, a typical view, I think a lot of maybe a lot of people are, who study science with you, this idea that if you're only into science because of the nice bits of it and the flashy facts, you're not really into science, you're just into some kind of superficial understanding of science, and kind of expressing a similar sentiment here. And I think, these are both entertaining, but I think what they do, and I think this sentiment is more common than we sometimes admit, they try and devalue the sense that you can engage in science in anything other than a purely, professional perspective. Imagine if we said the only way to really engage with sports is to be playing in front of a packed out crowd at Wembley. Imagine if we said the only way to really excel at music is to be, in a world-leading orchestra. Why do we have the sense that the only way to really go to the end of the road with science is to be a professional scientist who's getting a Nobel Prize or a paper in Nature? The way we're trying to take this to the British Science Association is to say that there's more than one endpoint to this journey. If we think about people in the bottom right, they're people, like perhaps most of the people here, like me, experts who are professionals in science and really involved. And then you've got people on the far left who perhaps don't engage in science at all. And what we're trying to do is create more ways for people to transition from being disinterested to being interested, so at least being receptive to the idea that science is cool. So these people probably don't think that science is rubbish, they just don't think it's for them. So how do you get people to be interested? And then how do you actually go beyond that and say, it doesn't matter that you you're not in a position to go and get a PhD in being a scientist. You can still be engaged, you can participate, you can critique, you can feel a sense of ownership, you can actually engage in a two-way discussion with scientists in our society. So we're in the middle of trying to map lots of those transitions onto existing audiences and new audiences to say, literally who are those people? Who are the people who are engaged right now? What sort of things do they do? What sort of events do they take part in? What sort of things do they read? And how do we find more ways for people who are interested to take that leap and again, feel like science is part of our identity? Because I think only once we kind of make that journey happen a bit more and create a really vibrant group of people who are engaged in science, and again provide that analogy to the group of people that are music fans, will we get beyond this sense that science is just for scientists and science is ghettoised in our culture, and get more to the stage where more people than just scientists really value science, promote science, argue for it, and see it as a fundamental part of who we are as a society. So that is a whistle-stop tour of how I see science and culture and what we're trying to do with the association. I hope you found it interesting and stimulating. I hope you disagree with some of it and can come back to me, because I'm really interested in having a chat with you and hearing what you think.
That was fantastic. I really, really enjoyed that. That was a stop point. It was great material and very stimulating.
Thank you.
I also have the privilege of being able to kick off questions. So I just thought, the first thing is just to ask, obviously we all need physicists, but Big Bang Theory, what effect has that had on people's perception of science?
So I think there's this really interesting tension. I'm going to try and come back to it. I think this was really interesting tension because the two cartoons I showed at the end there, in some ways they're great because these are people who are clearly talented artists, are very funny people using science as a subject, and those are artifacts of science in culture. That's an artifact of people. There's a group of people that feel strongly about science and are kind of creating a cocoon about themselves and saying this is who we are in the same way that we might with any other subculture. So that's a positive thing. So I think expressions of kind of nerd culture, geek culture, all that kind of stuff are actually really good in some ways because they show that here's something that people can get involved in, here's an identity that people have. What I worry about is, actually I don't worry about the Big Bang Theory as much. What tends to worry me a bit more is, for instance, the tendency, which I think the BBC is moving away from, that whenever you get a science programme on the BBC, it has to be presented by a scientist. This idea that we have, we've just got a new science minister who's been announced, Joe Johnson. The first thing that people say, well, he's not studied science, he's not a scientist, how can he be a good science minister? I think that attitude of saying only people who are in the club can join the club is kind of, it's really frustrating. So I'm not sure, I don't really watch the Big Bang Theory much, so I'm probably not the best person to ask, but I think there are both positives and negatives to that.
I have a teenage daughter who only watches Big Bang Theory, so it's been very good at getting her into those science. We were talking earlier on about the adult education side of things, which used to be a great way of getting a lot of people involved in science. I built up an adult education science program in Yorkshire. And thinking about that, the areas we were pretty successful. We had a very big program, and we had people coming back to courses over years. But it's in areas like, you had a picture of people looking at moths, natural history, bird study, which is a great vehicle for teaching people about all sorts of aspects of biology, earth sciences, astronomy. Those areas ran very well. It was a lot more difficult to get people into other areas of science, because in the end, an awful lot of it's hands-on. So, do you have thoughts about how you, in getting people to engage, how much of that's going to be a barrier to that engagement? That they will never, or it will be very difficult to really get into that lab environment?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. And I think there's two ways you can look at it. One is you could say that, to really understand what's going on in the field in question, you have to be hands-on. And I mean, that's great for subjects like ecology and ironically astronomy, because you can participate through some citizen science experiments we do have. I think there's an alternative way to look at it as well, by saying this interpretation of science we have, that the only expression of science is the experiments, can be unhelpful. So for instance, if someone gets a really good interaction, so for instance, Art Festival last year, we had a play being produced about drones, and it was basically a play about ethics and how you think about the technology of drones and what impact that has. And this year we've got a lecturer in law coming to talk about space law, like who owns space. And both of those things are completely hands-off. We're not going to actually bring a military drone that can kill people into our festival, and we're not going to take people into space to see who owns space. But we still have ways of getting people to engage in those less hands-on things. And it depends on whether you think that engagement is legitimate or not. Like this laughing at a comic about science, a legitimate form of expression within science. I think increasingly we should be saying that it is, rather than saying that the only gold standard is an experiment and a hands-on bit of research. I think that's great, and as I say, the stuff we're doing in schools through CREST, we should be doing more of that. But we should also acknowledge that that's limiting, because A, not everyone's going to be good at experiments and interested in experiments, and that shouldn't be a barrier to being interested in science. And B, it's not great for all forms of science, either because of practicalities or because some things are just inherently hard to get into.
I'm not quite a question. Other people? Yeah.
Thanks so much, man. That's really interesting. I just want to try and link up a couple of things you said. So
Sure.
You're talking about revealing the scientific process to a certain extent, and showing it's kind of messy and helping people understand that. And then you also showed another slide that showed that people's impression of science at school was really, really important to their intentions to go to do science. How do you then make those two things link up? So when you're in schools where they've got a very strict national curriculum and they're resource constrained, how do you then allow people or encourage people to have that slightly flexible scientific process? It's all well and good saying we should encourage them to do it, but when the school is so important, and resource constraints where educational resources are really tight, how do you actually make that happen?
I really, really wish there was like a simple answer to that question, but the truth is there's probably a million different things that we need to do. So for instance, I think we should be doing more things. Surprise, surprise, I say this, I think we should do more things like CREST that show young people looking at the realities behind science. I think we should be bringing in more narrative structures to say, let's not just look at the fact that Darwin discovered evolution, here's what it means, but let's look at the actual, the mental process he went through to figure out what he was doing. It wasn't just a simple leap, that actually there was a journey he went on that took decades. I think we should also, I think we should, if you look at how science is done now in the profession in research, ideas of, that's biology, this is chemistry, and that's physics, that's yesterday, and yet we still teach science in schools in that way. Wouldn't it be great if we could teach, climate change as a subject and say, here's the chemistry, the physics, and the biology behind it, but here's the geography, here's the sociology, here's all this other stuff. I think getting from where we are now to over there will be probably a generational shift at best. But I'd like to think that that's the sort of journey we should be going on, and that will require changing policy of curriculums and the way teachers teach and a whole range of other things. But yeah, there's no single answer. I think there's a whole range of things we need to do.
Lots of questions.
Yeah. Just a quick question about the study into school children's attitudes of science. Are they also looking at their attitudes to other subjects? Because it could be that most kids think school's boring anyway.
They are using comparatives, yeah. I can't remember what they are off the top of my head, but yeah, it's really fascinating data. So if you want to look at it, it's called Spires, and it's from King's College. Really exciting data.
Back.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. There's one thing missing in your presentation, which is the impact of gender in the number of scientists. So I think one very effective way to increase the number of scientists is to encourage women to work in science and to increase the number of female role models in science.
Yeah, I totally agree. And again, I don't want to mention Tim Hunt, but I think when that kind of stuff happens, it does have a negative effect. I mean, I've tried to deliberately steer away from that in a sense because I think, yes, we do want more scientists, and yes, we particularly want to redress the gender balance in science. But I think the biggest problem we have in science in the UK isn't necessarily the number of scientists, it's the number of people who are engaging with science who aren't scientists. Yeah, I mean, ironically, where I work, I'm one of the few men that work in my organisation because partly because of the phenomenon you're talking about, where women study science and then feel that the career in science isn't for them, and then end up working at places like mine. So strangely, the field of science communication is overrepresented for women because of the problem that science has with gender. So yeah, that's not an answer, but I agree with your comment effectively. Yeah.
Hi, that was a really interesting talk. I just wanted to ask a question about the governmental spending on science. So the research and development, £165 per person. It wasn't that surprising to see that there was such a negative aspect according to the evidence quote that you put up. But I was just wondering how much of that funding actually goes towards the implementation. So for example, if we look at climate change, over the last decade or so, there's been a massive shift towards recycling, towards being more aware of climate change. How much of that budget actually is pure, so that research development, is that just within the lab, within the actual field of research, or the implementation of what we're seeing and sort of the shift in culture we have seen over the last decade in terms of recycling?
I don't know the specific answer to that question, but if you want to go to the website, scienceaground.org, and every single bit of data that's gone into the calculation of those figures is on there, so you can dig it out and look it up. But the overall pattern is, as you say, it's unsurprising.
One more. So I'm going to shift across the other side again, so I'm just going to take up the back.
Horizon has always been a really useful program to communicate scientific discoveries.
Sorry,
Horizon.
Yeah.
But I've noticed over recent years it's kind of started to get softer and softer. And then in the last couple of years it started to resemble, on occasion, Channel 4 programs about diet. And I think that Horizon at its best is really engaging because it brings you on a journey that even a layperson can understand.
Yeah.
But when they're not telling the interesting story, but they're just going for the cheap sell, it kind of takes away one of the big communication tools that is available. And do you have any involvement? No, I don't think you're responsible for that. But is that a dialogue you would be having with the BBC in your role to say we need to be have a little bit more imagination?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to sort of pin the responsibility on any single organisation, let alone programme. I was actually having a chat with Imran Khan recently, so it's a topical question. And one of the interesting things he said was that there isn't really much of a consistent Horizon audience. There is a core, so I think their average figures tend to be about somewhere between 3.5 to 4.5 million for each show. That's just on the kind of the broadcast, because it goes up if you can, iPlayer. And of that, less than 1 million will kind of tune in every week, so that their variable audience is much higher than you would find for something like EastEnders or any other programme. So they're creating programs to cater to that variable audience, and the model that they think they follow is a third. So a third big science, so stuff that basically takes lots and lots of cool CGI graphics. A third, basically health type stories, and a third, what they call lifestyle things. So they're trying to kind of keep that, what you might call, slightly fluffier Channel 4 type stuff to a third. But it is effective in that it is getting in the audiences, and if what that does is get someone into watching Horizon, tuning in again, getting kind of hit by one of the big science programs, you could argue that's a good thing.
Well, thank you very much.
I'm sorry I talked so long and didn't
No,
give you questions. If you want to tweet at me, email me, drop me a line.
It's been really, really valuable. There were lots more questions, as you can see, so you've obviously stimulated even more interest than was here already, which was a lot. Thank you very much for your time, Imran. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.